Everybody, Patrick Hunter here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. It's boxing history time, my friends. That means I'm here with my boy Aris Pina, combi box operator, and of course, just fight history file like myself. What's up, bro? How you doing?
Everything's good, my man. How are you?
Doing all right, man. You know, it's seasons are growing colder and whatnot, but it's I guess the conversation's growing a little bit colder today. It's not a true crime episode, but I mean the feeling is similar. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of a downer, but the point being, we're talking about stuff where when we do these kind of more somber episodes, or we talk about tragic episodes or icky stories. You and I have talked about this before. This is just an opportunity for fighters to be remembered. We're not laughing at it. We're not pointing. We're not anything like that. But we're talking about a couple of junior bantamweights today, who both had, they met at one point in 1991,
Mhm.
bounced off each other in different directions, and each met early ends, way earlier than anybody expected. It's icky
Absolutely.
stuff, man.
Really, really is. So, yeah, the year is 1991. How old were you in 1991, Pat?
I mean, I was for most of the year because my birthday's in November. I would have been, like 8 years old. So
Same, same. My birthday is next month in October. So, for most of it, I was, what, six, I guess? Yeah. Um, but yeah, the year is 1991. Both of us, at least, were old enough to remember what was popping back then. Simpsons, Arsenio Hall, and Living Color. Hulk Hogan was on his way feuding with former GI Joe and now Iraqi turncoat Sergeant Slaughter. Um, yeah, New Jack Swing was still in full effect. New Jack City had just come out. 1991 was a good year. And another thing that was going on in 1991 was a promoter by the name of Cedric Kushner, my old boss, was being named IBF Promoter of the Year for probably the third or fourth year in a row. It is what it is, man. Every boxing, especially a high level promoter, got
good
their
old
little
Bob Lee,
yeah, exactly. The cha-ching, boom, boom. Yeah, yeah,
changing
definitely.
hands.
Stan Hoffman in the back there being a middleman and all this stuff. It was ridiculous times. But Cedric had a strong hold on the IBF. Bob Arum, had a little thing with the WBA, especially in the early 80s. Don King has always been affiliated with the WBC. It is what it is. So Cedric had an IBF guys. He had guys but really good fighters too. It wasn't like he had ShamWow champions. Like he had dudes like Welcome Nita, hell of a fighter. Um, another IBF, Orlando Canizales, one of the greatest bantamweights of all time, and a guy that's in the Hall of Fame and rightfully so, absolute wizard. So Cedric was promoting really good fighters, and another one that he's promoting at that time was a guy by the name of Robert Quiroga, and Robert Quiroga was the IBF junior bantamweight champion. You know what I mean? A really small, undersized guy, but a hell of a fighter, made for a lot of fun fights. Two-fisted, got in wasn't afraid of anything, and just made for a lot of memorable fights because he didn't have tremendous power, but he had respectable enough power, and he just was a dynamite of explosion. You know what I mean? He just didn't stop. And along the way, another junior bantamweight that was on the scene coming up probably a little bit before Quiroga, but also too was making strides and being heavily televised was a guy by the name of Kid Akeem Anifowoshe. I always mess up his last name. And Anifowoshe?
Pretty close. Anifowoshe.
Anifowoshe. Okay. I'm just gonna stick to Kid Akeem for
Well,
now.
and during the broadcast, they got pretty creative and pronounced it like several different ways too. So I mean, for quote unquote Western tongues or whatever, I know a lot of longer names are like not easy to pronounce for a lot of people. But yeah, Akeem Anifowoshe, Nigerian fighter, and that was another thing. And even though he was not directly had no direct relation or affiliation with Cedric Kushner, he also seemed to have a lot of Cedric. That is, he seemed to have a keener eye when it came to foreign fighters and foreign fights than a lot of other promoters, and seemed to have a little bit more of an open mind as far as what he was going to be promoting. And obviously that also made for Cedric was more of a kind of a peripheral promoter for a number of years. With all due respect, I mean, of course, he just wasn't one of the big two or three promoters. But that,
Anytime he got to that position, he got kind of screwed over. Let's be
yeah,
honest.
don't get me wrong. It's like a mom and pop shop trying to compete with fucking Walmart. You know, you just like you might have your niche or whatever, but when Walmart decides to like, roll over and squish you, there's nothing you can do about it.
It's all right. Another. I'll give you a Simpsons reference for Cedric right here. There was a character, not one of the main characters, but he's been so many episodes that people know him. His name was Gil. You remember Gil? He
I
was
mean,
a
yeah.
like really hard luck and always getting screwed over and everything like that, right? And then like there was one time Homer went to the car dealership and he got really excited to buy a car. He was going to get it from Gil, and Gil was like, "Yes, I finally got one!" Like he was all hyped. And when he walks into the dealership, straight out of something like what would happen in boxing, the guy goes, "I'll take it from here, Gil." He was like, "No, no." He was like, "I'm about to make this sale. I need this one." He goes, "Mm-hmm." He takes the sale from his hand and walks over away from Homer.
I
and then
mean,
and that
no
was kind of
better
like
example of that than the Rockman situation, you know?
exactly, you know what I mean? So it's like, but yeah, you're absolutely right in that regard. He was the type of guy that he was known for putting on fights in exotic locations. Like, for instance, Leroy Murphy, who was his cruiserweight champion in the 80s. I don't recall him actually fighting in the US that very often. You know, I mean, he'd either be in Italy or this place or that one. I think it was like the crazy knockout, double knockout that he had against Moody, Crisanda Moody, was it right? Um, I think that was like in Monaco or something like. So it's like he would always hold them in different locations, and that was one of his fortes. So like even if it was an American fighter like Orlando Canizales, he traveled to the UK to fight Billy Hardy. He fought other guys, France here there. That was his known thing. His fighters were world travelers.
Speaking of which, so Robert Quiroga, he was no exception either. Robert Quiroga fought overseas a handful of times leading into this fight. I mean, we've talked about so many fights, so many fighters on these boxing history episodes, and I mean, it's important to remember what it is we're discussing, what we're talking about, what these fighters are going through, how they often end up, how the stories generally end. And that's not, again, not because we want to be a downer, not because we're wanting to kick a dead horse or whatever, none of that kind of thing. It's just that, we do have to have some sort of baseline respect for what we're talking about here and what these fighters are being put through. And this, obviously, the story of, Robert Quiroga and Akeem Anifowoshe, it was the 1991 fight of the year, but it's one of those instances where almost like, and I mean, I'm going to say some slightly taboo shit here, so hopefully nobody gets super upset, but there are a number of other fights that were really good where some crazy or really bad tragic shit happened, and they get, um speaking of taboo, that might be the best word to use. It's like taboo to enjoy them, taboo to talk about them, taboo to acknowledge that they were good fights. And this fight of the year in 1991 kind of gets put on the back burner as far as good fights or great fights because of the outcome. Mancini Kim, obviously awful outcome, absolutely ridiculous fight in terms of action. I mean, just brutal and
Oh,
but it's the kind of thing where like, but you don't really want to go back and watch that a whole bunch of times or talk about it or, post photos of it. Nobody really wants to do that. And so this kind of falls toward those fights, although the shit that happened in the aftermath was so crazy that it's like, it goes, woo, it's going to get better. And then, whoa, it really doesn't, that's
it's
what's so
crazy.
crazy about this.
It's such a crazy story that I'm surprised there hasn't been a documentary or anything really been done on it because of like what we're going to get into with the post fight and everything like that. But I mean, it's absolutely wild to think. But both of their careers started on the fast track. Kid Akeem, for instance, I'll start with him. His story is really interesting. At first, like you, Pat, probably learned. I first read about him from about obviously from the Quiroga fight, but it was only in magazines. When I first read about it, this years before YouTube ever existed or anything of that matter, and I just kind of read bits and pieces of that it was a great fight, but that he collapsed. You know what I mean? And then as a kid, my parents actually bought me this book, Punchlines by the late great Phil Berger, who was a writer for what I have to actually
New
look.
York Times. I mean, I think he contributed to Sports Illustrated a number of times, but yeah, he was a good writer and a prominent writer.
Yeah, yeah, it was a great one, and I absolutely loved it. Like I devoured all the articles in this because like I learned about a lot of people in it. I read there was articles about like Ray Brown, not Ray Brown, Freddie Brown and Ray Arcel.
It's like a compendium of his
And
articles, so it's super easy to digest because you could just go article by article, you know.
totally. And it gives you like where it was written and everything like that. And like a lot of it was him being on scene talking to these people, you know. So like he had a really good one on Leon Spinks and Dave Jaco, that opponent we brought up plenty of times, but there was also one on Kid Akeem. And when I found that one, that was the most fascinating thing to me because again, I didn't know much about him. I just kind of knew him from the fight that he had with Quiroga. But this article went very in depth, talking about his background, how he grew up, how from when he came here to America and fast tracked almost from not even being like not even talking about his pro career, but being a very decorated amateur at a very young age.
Yeah, no question. It goes into just enough detail to give you a very good picture of like his childhood and how he got into boxing. There's, a couple of funny anecdotes. It says that he had been getting picked on by his sister and got beaten up by his sister. And so he went into a boxing gym and first started learning how to box, but then kind of fell out of it, started getting into trouble, started, getting in trouble out on the streets, joined some sort of street gang or something like that, a bunch of street urchins going around robbing people, which, it's not a funny thing, but nonetheless, a bunch of kids. And then at some point he robbed some lady who beat him up, some lady who, just whooped his ass. And I don't know if it's just that Kid Akeem just could not take the embarrassment of getting his ass whooped by a woman. I don't know. It sounds like this was not good for him. So 2 times an ass whooping from a girl sent him to the boxing gym. He went back to the boxing gym apparently,
It's
and
funny because I'm remembering this whole story and the way he explains it is exactly like he straight up got robbed the wrong person one day. She just mollywopped him on the block, you know?
yeah, he was like a young teenager, 12, 13, 14, something like that. So yeah, you think about you at that age try to rob a grown woman, you might get fucking, yeah, you might get got. And so that's exactly what happened. He took his ass back to the boxing gym and started actually working in the boxing gym. And it sounded like too, just to make a point, he did not come from poverty in Nigeria that I could see. His dad was a truck driver or a bus driver, and his mom worked in a bar or ran a bar. So it wasn't like they, at least from my understanding, it didn't sound like he came from poverty, but that he chose to go onto the street for whatever reason. So in any case, he found himself back in the boxing gym and was good enough to make the Nigeria national team, and then had traveled for, I guess, the Olympics or for the qualifiers or something like that, to the US. And then when he had gotten to the US, they asked him what his age was, and the way that it's written, it kind of seems as though he was probably expected to lie and say he was older, but he did not, and he was only 15, and so
Whoops.
no dice, no competing.
I mean, that's wild too. It's because like Eldrick Taylor was 17 when he won Olympic gold. I think the youngest US fighter to win Olympic gold, correct me if I'm wrong, is Jackie Fields.
I think so, yeah.
1916 though, so I mean like, you know,
And
and
I think the youngest is who's that, Terry Spinks, I want to say,
yeah. Okay.
who was like 14 or some 13 or something crazy, like something then you see pictures and you're like, wow, that's a kid. Anyway,
You're totally right. Yeah, most people would lie about it. He didn't think anything of it because I don't think he knew that there was an age requirement. So he wrote 15, and he got denied. But instead of going back home, he decided to stay in the U.S. And initially, who he linked up with was the first guy that linked up with George Foreman, Doc Brodus, the old trainer from the Job Corps. And Brodus was, a no nonsense guy. He wasn't going to tolerate anything, especially taking a guy like Foreman back in the day, who was as reckless and mean and nasty as anybody you could ever meet. And he shaped him up to be like a a disciplined, good fighter. So he fell under his wing for a little bit. And Kid Akeem still stood as an amateur, but then as is stated in the book, and also too like his box rec amateur record is way incomplete, like every amateur record is on that app. His last fight as an amateur was, I think, in the World Championships, and he got robbed against a Russian fighter, I think, or something like that, right?
Yep.
And from there,
Or at least
he
he felt he was robbed. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And he even said it afterwards. He was crying. He couldn't believe what was happening. He was just really just because he was a person. Kid Akeem was the type of person that, like, and you'll see as we talk more about him, he was a guy that was like had a lot of high belief in himself, a lot of a lot of self belief, and nothing really phased him. Like he was that guy. You know what I mean? And anytime something like when you have so much self confidence and you're built off of that, and then you get your shit robbed, like either you lose or something happens that really rattles you, you take it harder than other people can, and that's essentially what happened with him there. And so instead of trying to do that, that's when he decided at that point to turn pro. And he was still a high school student at this point too. Excuse me. So he's in high school like a lot of fighters that started early out in. Sean O'Grady, a bunch of other ones. They're still students writing the books in while they were knocking out palookas and God knows what on weekends. And Kid Akeem was no different, fighting every few weeks or whatever, making purses, 600, sometimes to 1,000, whatever. Like he was building himself up, but at the same time, he was building a following because where he was based out of. So
Yeah, so he was in Las Vegas. Doc Brodus lived in Las Vegas, even though George Foreman was, quote unquote, discovered or whatever in Texas. Doc Brodus lived in Las Vegas, and so that's where Kid Akeem was staying. And supposedly he was in high school and was a straight A student, and picked everything right up, like here in the U.S., and did great, assimilated, as they say, very well, and just kind of was living his life and doing well as a fighter. Like you said, disillusioned with his last amateur fight and decided to turn pro. And so, you know, as any fighter is developed, they're probably going to find out fairly quickly, is this fighter worth latching onto? Is this fighter worth supporting? Is this fighter worth pumping money into? Are we going to get anything out of this fighter? And Anifowoshe had international amateur experience. That alone, having gone to the World Amateur Championships, which I think was in Reno, I want to say at the time that year. Having potentially gone to the Olympics, etc. Those are pretty lofty things as far as an amateur record goes. So somebody with those kinds of things on their amateur record, verifiably, are going to be in somewhat high demand. And on top of that, he's 112, 115 pounds. He's like 5'7", 5'8", which is really tall and lanky for that weight class. It makes sense. That's the kind of fighter that you're probably going to want to keep an eye out for. And so, you go through, like you said, Anifowoshe's record, and yeah, there's some kind of regular characters on there, guys with like 10 fights or less, some guys making their debuts, etc. However, you do see a number of fighters with winning records, and that's something that you might not see these days through his, maybe first 10 fights or so, which, hey, I mean, he was obviously, they were expecting something out of him. But we've also talked about this before too. So getting into, gosh, I'd have to say, without counting real quick, it's like 18 fights or something like that. He wins the NABF NABF Junior Bantamweight Championship. And like you and I have talked about before, the NABF, like some other of these like secondary organizations, back in the day, it's not that they were mistaken for actual world title belts, but they did have some sort of meaning because they could propel you forward in the rankings and get you a shot at one of those world title belts. And that's one of those things that was followed a lot more closely back then than it is now, because there's just so many fucking belts that you can't,
oh no,
you
most
can't.
definitely. And at the jump on you for that, like on your back with that one, it's absolutely true. Like the back, if you're an NABF champ or a USBA champ, for example, that automatically puts you in the top 10. You know what I mean? And usually, if you won that title and you're in a hot division, there was a good chance you were going to be defending that belt on TV. not necessarily HBO or Showtime, but there was a chance, high probability you'd be in the main event of, say, USA Tuesday Night Fights or an ESPN show for that matter. You know what I mean? Like that fight, those networks always showcased, USBA title fights, NABF title fights, and guys like that. Like I used to see Charles Brewer defending that belt before he became world champion, various others. Like those were high profile fights. And usually after that, the guy that was, the champion, NABF, USBA, whatever it may be, um, soon after, they they would uh jump into an HBO opportunity against world champion or Showtime for that matter, or sometimes even like on a pay-per-view undercard, just it was good. So, and I felt for Kid Akeem to be NABF champion in a division like junior bantamweight definitely means he's going to be hot shotted to a title fight relatively quickly, because that wasn't even a like super deep division to begin with in terms of like name recognition, stuff like that. One more example, it would be a guy like now this is a really deep cut. There was a dude by the name of Henry Hot Pepper Brent, who was a
Mhm.
flyweight from New York City in the early 80s. That's kind of crazy to think about, right? That, a guy from New York that was a flyweight, like, because not many American flyweights were around back then. But he had a record of like 9-5 or something like that, and he was a two-time USBA champion. So,
Well, and often you see a lot of not to belabor the point, and also not to pick on these little guys, because we love the smaller divisions. It has nothing to do with that. But you do often see a lot more of the records where it comes to fewest fights before winning a world title. You
yeah.
often see them in the smaller weights. I mean,
Well,
not just because they're smaller weights too. A lot of those fighters were former Muay Thai champions who got into boxing, so they didn't really need much of an introduction. They just fucking, in their fourth fight fought for a world title and it was fine. But in any case, that's something that you do see a lot more of in the lower weight classes. And unfortunately, sometimes because there's less, competition, there's just not, you got to scrape the barrel a little bit sometimes, unfortunately.
sure, sure. But Kid Akeem was getting, the fact that he was based in Las Vegas at this point. Now, Top Rank, he was working with Top Rank, and he was being featured on TV. And like you said too, like his, some of the level of his competition was a little iffy going up, but he was doing what he was supposed to do with these guys. He wasn't like going the distance with them. He was blasting them out unceremoniously and looking really good doing it. Like he had a personality to him. He was a good looking guy. He wore flashy trunks. And at this point now, Miguel Diaz, as we know, a Hall of Fame world class trainer, took over with him. And Miguel Diaz, till this day, will always say that Kid Akeem was one of the most talented fighters he ever worked with. Like he was just a natural, absolute natural in the ring. And he looked the part too. When you would see him on ESPN, there's clips of him, not many of them, but there's clips on YouTube. He's just blasting dudes left and right. He looked like a miniature Thomas Hearns back then.
He actually was working with Roger Mayweather too, and you could see it a little bit in the fight with
Wow.
Quiroga. You could see just a tiny bit. Well, in not a not good way too, and that's something that we see with fighters these days too, trying to emulate to bad effect. And but yeah, he was working, looking good. He was a good looking fighter, passed the eye test in
Yeah.
terms of what he looked like in the ring. Obviously made there were a lot of mistakes he made with his style, but he was making it work for him. And yeah, was looking really good. It and actually we'll get to the kind of pre-fight in a second, and kind of pivoting over to Robert Quiroga, who is a
Mhm.
kid from San Antonio. He was fairly, it sounded like, generally speaking, he was somewhat quiet. He was a guy who was fairly connected to and in tune with his community and his family.
Sure.
And I don't really know that much personally about his early boxing upbringing, and I couldn't really find a ton. A lot of the stuff that was written about him later on focused on other stuff. But
Mhm.
regardless, I do know that he was considered, a hot prospect and a very exciting fighter. And he was the kind of fighter who you definitely wanted to watch. He was an action fighter, pressed
Yeah.
the issue, brought the fight, had good power in both hands. Uh, there's not a whole lot really to ask for from a fighter, I guess, you know. Um, yeah. And so, and it's also, I'm sorry to, I know you were just about to say something in Texas too. There's this, nothing has changed in the last several decades. Texas has always been something of a hotbed when it comes to boxing and like local boxing.
Totally. And you know, I'm trying to think about like what the Texas boxing scene was when Quiroga was coming up in the late '80s. So, you know, the Ayelas were that was a whole disaster in itself. So I mean, that wasn't really in the picture. Stevie Cruz, by the time Quiroga started, you know, making strides, I think had lost his WBA title to Antonio Esparagoza, so he was out. Um, Donald Curry was fizzling out at that point, and I'm sure I'm missing someone. I'm sure there's some guy that was like from Texas that was really popular, but Quiroga got a following from where he was from, and in San Antonio, always being a hot fight town in itself, and you know, a popular bumping area, like he got a following. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I was about to say, yeah, the Canizales brothers are from Texas.
Oh yeah, okay, there you go.
I was like, dude, we're missing
Yeah,
somebody. Hold
I know,
on.
like
I knew
something
it.
was off
I knew
there,
it.
but like Texas always, you know, had is like known for like homebred, like really passionate about their sports and their sporting icons, whether it's like, you know, the Cowboys or especially football. They love football out there, but like and other stuff. But when it comes to boxing too, if they got a good fighter that's really making strides and doing something, you know, and is a positive guy and not just an actual like jackass like someone like Adrian Broner, um, excuse me, they will stand right. They'll get really behind you. You know what I mean? Remember when Errol Spence, for instance, what was that on Cowboy Stadium against the No Holper? Yeah, filled the
Uh,
shit out of the place.
was that the Ugas fight or
No, maybe not 10. Well, he filled someplace out against like Ocampo or somebody, didn't he?
I don't remember what fight it was, but I know that he's gotten some support in Texas. Yeah.
Huge, huge support out there. So, um, you know, it's like Quiroga was one of those guys, and plus, like you said, with his exciting style, he was can't miss. So he's going through the strides of just fighting, like you said, suspects of coming up because again, it's not the deepest when you're still moving up. So you know, some of the records on Box Rec, they might be a little incomplete here and there. I'm sure when these guys were introduced to the ring, they weren't being known as 0 and 4 and 3 and 6 and stuff like that. But by the time in 1989, when this is when some of the more recognizable names come up for him, well, the first name that'll pop up to you is Joey Olivo. And Joey Olivo was another very different looking type of junior flyweight back in the day, former world champion, tall guy, I believe, too. So he just looked a little awkward and odd for his division, but he was a guy that he beat Hot Pepper Brent for the USBA flyweight title. He also fought Hilario Zapata and a host of others. Like he was a guy that was around. He was the one American that was a really good fighter in like the flyweight divisions of the early '80s. So for him to beat Olivo and score a notch over him belt like that, even though it's 1989, is still like a very big win. And then from there, you know, after a couple of more defenses of the USBA belt, he fights Juan Polo Perez, and this is for the IBF championship. And obviously, this is Cedric promoting this because it was taking place in the UK. A Colombian and a dude from San Antonio, Texas, fighting in the UK. Yeah. So Juan Polo Perez, for me, when I grew up, and you probably remember, I'll agree with this too, Pat. I just knew him as being the guy that was always getting knocked out anytime I picked up a magazine. There was like a thing of Perez getting stopped by this person, that one, Hamed knocking him out. This like anytime I picked up a Boxing Digest or a Ring magazine or KO, and it gave you the summary of what was happening, there would be Juan Polo Perez getting starched by someone in it usually.
And it was almost always some fighter that like it was in some foreign country that you'd never got to see that fighter.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But he
So
was
we
always,
had a bad impression of Juan Polo Perez, is what we're saying, unfortunately.
I mean, by the mid '90s, but you know, to give him credit, he was a good fighter before whatever happened. He's hit a skid mark, you know, skid row, and then just that was it. You know, once you hit that bump in the road, that was it for my man. But I mean, before then, he was decent, and but he Quiroga beat him for the title, and then like we talked about in the beginning of the show, that's when he went on his little world tour. He fights Vianney Neen, who was a very good underrated South African fighter from the late '80s, and stops him, and he fought him in Italy. See, that's Cedric's way of just, you know, taking his champions and putting them on tours like that. Vincenzo Belcastro, that one makes more sense. That was held in Italy as well. And then we get to the fight that we're about to talk about right now with Kid Akeem.
Yeah, so he fought 3 fights in a row, including his title-winning effort out of the United States. The fight immediately before that was against another San Antonio kid named Ray Medell, El Leoncito, who was not like a super famous fighter, but was a local fighter and was like a, I don't know if I would say beloved, but a fighter that people liked. They rooted for him in San Antonio. And it was a fight between 2 local San Antonio guys. And so Quiroga won a commanding decision against him and had not been back since. And so what wound up happening was that Cedric Kushner picked this up and was handling the promotion. And I could not say exactly why. I have absolutely no idea, no answers. All I know is that the reporting on it going into the fight was that they had expected a much bigger crowd. They were saying, "Oh, we're going to jam in 10,000 people." Into this arena that they had a handful of fights in the last few years before then that had done very well, and so they had expected this to sell very well too. And by like 4 or 5 days before the fight, they had only sold 1,500 tickets. And they were, and so Cedric Kushner and the other people who were involved in the promotion took to the newspapers and were saying, "We're expecting a lot of walk-ups. We're expecting a lot of walk-ups." It's the age. This is 1991, dude. Here we are in fucking 2020. They still say the same thing. It's the same fucking line in 2023. It was funny, but they're expecting a lot of walk-ups and shit like that. It wound up only being about 3,500, 4,000 people total. So not like miserable, but not
Yeah.
very good either. But they literally said that Quiroga went out to the park where
Mhm.
people were gathered in the park and was telling people to go to the fight, was going to clubs, was going to just like random places, other sporting events, literally was like beating the drum, like doing his own promotion. Um, and I mean, on some level, fighters are expected to do some of that stuff, but it sounds like he was going like above and beyond to get people to come to this fight. And it just sounds like the main takeaway here was that it was kind of sad. Like it was sad that he's from San Antonio, and that he should be well known because he's a world champion, but that they're really struggling to sell tickets and they can't really sell tickets. And it's not his size either, because a number of the successful fights that they had there at that same venue in the last few years were other lower weight fighters. So it's like, this is not a very good sign. And so that's kind of a lot of what the pre-fight promotion had to do with. And then they get to the pre-fight press conference. At the pre-fight press conference, it sounded like they didn't really know each other that well, but shit heated up pretty quickly, like real quick. Started
Yeah.
cursing at each other, started cussing, started saying all sorts of shit. Um, Akeem Anifowoshe, like I said, Quiroga, slightly quiet, a guy who probably doesn't normally talk a whole lot of shit. Anifowoshe was saying uh, he would bet his make a side bet, basically winner take all bet his purse that on whoever won or whatever. And Quiroga wouldn't do it, and he was saying like, "Oh, this is Texas, we don't do shit like that out here." And Anifa Woshe said, "Well, then you're acting like a woman," and that's of course, here we go. And Quiroga got all riled up. They started squabbling at each other and stuff like that, and that's how it got all heated up.
Bet
um
your purse, bet your purse. Like,
it's like the most
never
bullshit.
taken that bet.
What's that?
No one's ever taken that bet in boxing, even though they all did it. Like I think the last
Not
time
since like 1872 or something. Like, like, I'll take that bet, Sonny Jim. Yeah,
yeah.
no, dude, nobody's taking that fucking bet. But that was enough, I guess, to rile each other up and snipe at each other and stuff like that. So there was a little bit of bad blood going into this fight, even if it was not, even if it was slightly manufactured from the press conference or whatever. But nonetheless, it, like I said earlier, it's a good fight.
Oh
It's
yeah.
a very good fight, bruising fight.
But the thing that's like, messed up about it too is that there was already signs that things just shouldn't have been the way they were. First off, the IBF allowed 6-ounce gloves for lower weight fighters back then. 6-ounce gloves is insane. Okay. They use, correct me if I'm wrong, they use 4-ounce gloves in MMA, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Which is a little fingerlint nothing. And so, but that's different. That's like the five, whatever, 15, 5-minute rounds that they do. And then most of the time too, because of this grappling and other stuff, it's not just strictly, but this is boxing, like where you just use your hands. And with two guys who are known to be ultra aggressive, guys that have considerable power, and they're gonna come full on at each other, and we're gonna use 6-ounce gloves. That's just a recipe for disaster in many ways. And that was kind of the start of it. But like, I think for another thing too, this was on pay-per-view, and I remember this because in a magazine I read they were talking about this being only like 10 or 15 bucks to buy, compared to complaining back in the 90s how pay-per-views were like 60 bucks, and rightfully so, because inflation would be around the same price today or something. So it's like, um, but that was the main thing. That was like 6-ounce gloves right there. It's just kind of like, wait, what? And then from the start of it, it was just absolutely a vicious war. Like Quiroga was a two-fisted just machine. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't an out and out brawler. I mean, he wasn't an offensive wizard, but he wasn't a guy that just walked in and ate like 4 punches to land two. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't like that. He had technique to his game, but he was an extreme pressure fighter who threw multiple amount of punches around. And like you said, Kid Akeem, he was more of a boxer, but he was a guy that threw a lot of punches too, especially if you came at him. He was going to try to knock your head off. And he was trying to do that when he was keeping right there and going toe to toe with him. But Quiroga was able to negate that and get right in him pretty quickly. And what it started was just like you said, man, like in a war of attrition. But it was more so like Kid Akeem's precision punching against Quiroga's volume. And at first, Quiroga's volume was what was looking, ahead so far.
That actually that reminds me too, because the glove issue did wind up coming up in the aftermath.
Yeah.
And getting back to the fight in just a sec, that reminds me, I'm almost positive that while he might not have been leading the commission, I'm almost positive that Dickie Cole was working on the commission during this time period. And this was right around when he was ratings chairman for the WBC too. So I mean, all sorts of conflicts of interest there that are just like, what the fuck. But so the IBF, like you said, was allowing 6-ounce gloves for these lower weight divisions. It was like, I think, bantamweight on down or something like that. And so but Texas supposedly at the time was not allowing 6-ounce gloves at all. So there must have been some sort of wrangling. And as crappy as Dickie Cole was, dude, I definitely would not put it past this dude. In any case, I just reminded me in any of that. But in any case, getting back to the fight, dude, early rounds, very bruising. And I think that you can see even just a few rounds in where it's like you can see both fighters. It's like they don't really seem like they want to fight this fight. Like they neither of them really, like they don't really want to brawl, because
Yes.
both of them are kind of like they're trying to move their head. They're trying to, they're trying to slip. They're trying to, you see Quiroga doing a lot of, what do they, I've heard it called a couple different things, like pitch and catch, pitch and counter, or catch and counter, stuff like that, where, you kind of ride with the punch and then counter back.
Yeah.
He's doing that like all fight long. And it's just like, it's a good strategy against somebody who doesn't have the style of Anifowoshe. And
Mhm.
then in the exact opposite, Anifowoshe is in times fighting in the style where he's bringing his right hand down to about here instead of leaving it up. And then he's bringing his lead hand so that it's out over here. And he's just getting cracked with left
Yes.
hooks, fucking left and right, and leaning right back into him. And so you can see that, like, it's just the exact wrong style. Like it might work against some other fighters, but not this one. And so both of them are just fighting the wrong style against the other one and just beating the shit out of each other for it, bro.
Oh, and it was really bad. Like Quiroga and his pressure and Kid Akeem, like Quiroga's face right away too, because he had that type of again, it's
Like
the way.
like immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the bone structure around him, like the cheekbones and stuff like that. Like he would always cut easily. That was one of his things in his
Yeah.
fights.
My face used to get super red. Like, so it's like you take like two punches and you're like, "Ugh,"
Oh, absolutely. And then
it
some guys
happens.
it's tough because cheeks right there, it's kind of sharp, you slip right, and by like second or third round, bop, he was already cut really really badly in the fight, and it didn't really stop him. I mean, as he got cut, he was still like you said, man, just whooping him with combinations to the head and body, left and right, and oh man, with 6 ounce gloves too, dude. It's just like Robert Quiroga wasn't a guy that was a knockout puncher, but he was a volume guy. And you keep on getting hit over and over and over like that by a guy who just keeps on nonstop. It's going to take its toll on you after a while. It's going to take a heavy toll on you, in fact. And Kid Akeem, though, to his credit, was just standing there. But like you said, he was fighting the wrong fight and he was taking a hell of a lot of punishment, but he was dishing out a lot of it too. It was
Oh,
just almost like
man.
he was just trying, it was just hard for him to keep up with the whole volume of what Quiroga was putting out there.
There was so much offense going on that it's almost difficult to gauge what exactly is happening with the momentum. Like you don't really know who's winning this round, who like who's it would be like, Anifowoshe was doing a great job with his jab, and then he'd like pepper off a couple like bap bap, 1 2 1 2 3 type of shit, and they would all land, and then all of a sudden he'd get hit with the left hook and kind of pitch backward, and then he'd look immediately okay, and you're like, what the fuck? Are you hurt or not? Like I don't know what the fuck is going on here, bro.
And
But
also,
a lot of the fight looked like that.
And also, too, what was really noticeable was that where all the punishment Quiroga was doling out on him, Kid Akeem looked unscathed. Like he didn't look like he was even in a fight. He had a little slight swelling on his face, but like otherwise, he was pretty unmarked. Quiroga's face was falling apart at the seams. Each round, it was getting a little bit worse. It's cut over here, cut over there, swelling really badly. Like he was taking a hell of a lot of punishment. And even though he was winning the fight in the majority of the rounds, like it was a close fight, but like you have the sense that Quiroga was still just kind of controlling things a little bit, even though it was vicious as shit. You were wondering if his face was going to hold up enough to make it to the finish line because there was many times in there in that fight where it just looked like it wasn't going to end well for him. You know what I mean? He took a lot of punishment. Lips was all cut. Like his whole face looked like he got mugged. Someone took a bat and just bashed him in.
Oh,
But
the replay where there's a replay where the punch that cut him open, it like
mhm.
barely touched him. It was like the most grazing shot, and it just slight or right over his eyebrow, sliced the shit out of his eyebrow. And I mean, it shit happens. Fighters get cut. It's a fight. But like, yeah, he looked bad, dude. However, toward the middle rounds, Anifo Oshe, I thought started catching up and started looking like Quiroga started looking at a few points like he wasn't entirely sure what to do. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, bobbing, weaving, whatever. But neither of them had super great head movement apart from the occasional bob and weave type of shit. And then they're both still getting just bashed. And then Quiroga started looking like maybe he was getting a little bit tired. The big problem for Anifo Oshe was that in like probably 4 or 5 different rounds, he was doing pretty well for the like maybe 2 minutes, 2 minutes 30 seconds, and then Kuroga would just start slamming him with shots and the like, especially against the ropes. And Anifa Woshe was going up against the ropes, and I think that this is where the commentating was a little bit off. And they're like, "Oh, yeah, he's taking those on the gloves," and I'm looking at it like,
Well,
"He
he
ain't
was.
taking all those on the gloves, bro. Not all of them. Like he's eating some of those for sure." And then you finally started to kind of see a little bit of damage on Anifa Woshe's face, or at least mostly his lip. It looked like something was bleeding in his mouth, and his mouth was wide open. So I mean,
Ton of punishment, bro. And
oh, it was brutal.
I think because I'm not sure. I don't think CompuBox tracked the fight, but
No, they even said early on, they said, I wish we had a punch stat or a punch counter because we don't have any, I'd like to know what blah blah blah. So
Cedric wasn't putting out the money for no stats. They're already losing enough on the promotion as it was.
yeah, it sounded like it didn't sell very well.
But it was estimated that Quiroga landed over 400 punches, and just almost strictly to the head, not even counting his body afterwards. So that's insane. That's like combined more than what Tyson and Ruddock landed in their rematch, or even both of their fights, probably.
No, Anifa Woshe landed plenty too. So
Oh,
I
I
mean,
mean,
it's not
oh,
like
yeah,
that
that's
was
what it is. Yeah, like
yeah,
it
it
was
was
just
two-way traffic.
it was just a brutal. Well, it's one of those really vicious fights that, like, afterwards that you're gonna be aligned with that guy forever, but you hope it's in a positive way. Like you just sit there and you embrace, and then maybe have a rematch one day, but you always kind of like Gotti and Ward, for instance. Everyone wants that, beautiful Cinderella story and them becoming brothers at the end and such, right? And you would hope that was going to be the case with this fight because it was so brutal, but like neither guy really give it an inch, even though that, one swayed at one point, the other one swayed, the momentum came here and there, but like you got the sense that it was a close fight and a fight that could have gone either way, maybe, you know what I mean? And then the scorecards don't reflect that. But like from me watching it, I always got the sense I thought that Quiroga won it. You know what I mean? Like going back and watching it again, like I thought he won it by like it was a very close margin. I didn't have it the way the judges had it, but like I thought Quiroga might have edged it by a point or two just by his overall, activity and everything else that he did. But like it was a really close fight. And then if you look afterwards too, if you look at Quiroga and you look at Kid Akeem, who looked like the winner and who looked like the loser? You know what I mean? Quiroga looked like he was just came out of a gory car wreck. Kid Akeem just looked like he, had like a tough sparring session for like 8 rounds or so with like a slightly bloody mouth and like, a puffed up eye, but nothing worse to wear. And so it was one of those fights that like everyone realized they saw something special. And everyone's kind of like, high fiving and clapping and saying, wow, man, this was incredible. And then the tragedy struck.
Yeah, this is where it kind of, if the fight weren't enough, the
Mm-hmm.
fight was damn good. Was it fight of the year level? Yeah, I'd say it's fight of the year level.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
definitely.
there aren't a whole lot of fights where I'm trying to think of like, Chacon Limon 4, Gotti Ward 1, but not all the way through, just a couple times. Morales Barrera 1, Sith Chachawal, Monshapur.
Yeah.
There aren't a
Was
whole lot of fights.
Gotti Wilson Rodriguez fight of the year?
Well, I'm trying to think of fights where like there were just times where the fighters just like let go and we're just like, you know what? Like let's fucking do this. And at a
Yeah.
couple times that's what happened. And like not even because they wanted it with Quiroga and Ifowoshe. You know what I mean? Like they just were like, bro, we've gotten our ass kicked so much in this fight, we got no choice but to stand here and punch, and so there aren't a whole lot of fights where that actually happens. You know what I mean? Like nobody really wants to get hurt. So somebody's going to try to get the upper hand. Every so often, though, a fight like, that should happen in a fight. And that should have happened here a bunch of different times. So in any
It's
case,
but like not to cut you, I'm so sorry, but like
yeah,
think about that, bro. It's like again, the to go back, Kid Akeem did like it was his self belief. Remember after losing his last amateur fight and believing in himself the way he did, he didn't think anyone could ever beat him. Quiroga fighting in his hometown finally after years of being, a roadway champion. He's not trying to lose in front of his town either. So it's like that's even brings it even more so that these guys are going to be fucking each other up like that. So
and that was actually something that Quiroga specifically said going into this fight too, was that he fought that dude Belcastro, Vincenzo Belcastro, immediately before this fight. And he said, I fought this dude in Italy and the
uh,
fans, I like, damn near whitewashed him. And the fans were just like nonstop cheering for him. Like they were coming, showing out so hard for this guy. And I want that. Like
yeah,
I felt that when when we were fighting, and I want that in my hometown.
absolutely.
And so, that's a totally different kind of motivation. And then on the opposite side, Nifa Woshe wants to go into this guy's hometown and show him what's what. Totally different but similar motivations. And so Quiroga winds up coming out with a unanimous decision with scores that perhaps might not be reflective of how the action really was. It was very, very close. And yeah, I think that though what kind of edges it for Quiroga, like I said earlier, was that he stole a bunch of the rounds and did very good work late. And it was good work. Immediately after the decision is read, from what I was reading about reports, his trainer and the person who was basically Anifa Woshe's like assistant, I guess, like because he, I guess, used to travel with somebody who was with him
Mm.
frequently, and it was another, I believe, Nigerian dude, but I'm not positive. In any case, they asked the guy when he was interviewed, what was going on, and he said, "Yeah, he was the only thing he did was he came up and asked me how did I look, and then the next thing I knew, he rolled over, vomited blood, and like passed out." So, and that's pretty much what the officials who were standing around were saying, similar things, that he was talking, he was standing there, he seemed fine, and then just kind of fell down, vomited blood, and then his friend person also said he swallowed a lot of blood, that he had swallowed a ton of blood because something in his mouth was bleeding. So he was taken to a nearby hospital, and basically they didn't make it clear whether he fell into a coma or whether he was put into a medically induced coma. It sounded like he fell into a coma. Um, but Quiroga also wound up having to go into plastic surgery for a few hours after the fight. Had an awful cut. He had something, I think, going on in his mouth. There was something else, like he said, his arm or his hand was messed up. I mean, he got banged up pretty good too. And he wound up finding out that Quiroga was there, that Anifowoshe was hurt, and he said somewhat standard things, that he didn't mean to hurt him, that he basically, that this is what we signed up for, that he wasn't trying to do anything on purpose.
Of course.
Um, but actually, it's actually kind of crazy too, because it's not very often when a fighter, I mean, thankfully it doesn't happen that often in general, but it's not very often when a fighter like passes out after a fight, or goes into a coma or something like that. Usually when that happens, like a very high percentage of the time it ends very badly, whether it's death or permanent disfigurement or permanent disability, like severe disability, like
Sure.
Magomed Abdusalamov, for instance. It's
I was
not often that fighters survive when they get to that point, and when they do, it's usually not a
mhm.
full life, or functioning quote unquote normally. But somehow
Get
Akeem
it.
Anifowoshe, they kept updating his condition and said that we don't know, but he seems to be improving. His wife apparently, a couple days after he was in a coma, said, "Yeah, oh yeah, he's moving his legs when I tell him, he was moving his hands, um, etc." Like they said, "Do you fight at 118 pounds?" And he's mouthing yes, or 115 pounds or whatever. So I don't know. I'm not entirely sure medically or physiologically what the fuck happened. No idea. But
But
somehow he woke up.
the thing is that in the article as well, like you said, he Kid Akeem did wake up, and I think he was shocked at first because he clearly he didn't know what happened to himself, and then when he realized came to the realization that, like, I think he said that he saw himself in the mirror, saw, like, gnarly scar on his head, and he was all weak, and he was like kind of in a wheelchair and stuff, and he didn't know what the fuck was going on. And, like, a person that was like so strong and strong minded and had all these goals and ambitions in life and thought no one could beat him, and all of a sudden he's being told he's never going to fight again, and he has this scar on his head, and his life has been altered even though he miraculously came out of it. Like, clearly he's going to have some issues in the long road of recovery ahead. It's hard to accept that type of, it's really, really hard to accept something like that. And um when he finally was able to go home, in the book they talked about, and this is a guy, like, almost like delusional too, and I'll explain what I mean, is that he was asked, so how are you doing today? He was like, oh, did you know I walked around? He was like, and Phil Berger, I think it was, like, asked him suspiciously if someone said, oh, you walked around today? He was like, yeah. He was like, I walked around, 3 blocks or something like that. Sharon just walked behind me just in case, but I'm good. He was like, I did this, I did that, and all this stuff, right? And then after he got done saying that, you see his wife, she had to help him, like, get into his wheelchair and then try to move him somewhere else because he was like kind of too weak to really move. And then he asked her afterwards, did he really walk all this? And she said, no, he didn't do any of that. So
Yeah, he said that he had plans to fight again.
yeah.
That he was, just wait until I get back in the ring, gonna resume my career. That wasn't quite in the cards for him.
Not at all.
Um, and it's actually not totally clear. At least a portion of the story, I couldn't really find much confirmation. Um, but there was other stuff that I did find confirmation about. So after Akeem Anifowoshe wakes up,
Mhm.
he decides that actually, when he was in his coma, he had a dream, and he dreamed about a man, a witch, like a witch doctor.
Mhm.
And so he traveled back to Nigeria to undergo an operation
Okay.
to get blood drained, and got a number of different slices made on his body and got quote unquote blood, black blood drained from his body.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm not trying to talk shit here, but like this falls under the umbrella of known like con artist shit.
Totally.
Like, I don't know if you remember that video probably a couple decades ago now, where like dudes were performing surgery, with their
Oh,
hands on people and
that
like
was
using
Andy
like
Kaufman.
chicken guts, and you know what I'm saying?
That
Like,
was Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman went to the Philippines to get his for when he had cancer, and when he was about to pass away, and he went there for that to the Philippines for that treatment. And
it's just
the
trickery. It's
photos,
just,
yeah,
yeah.
complete trickery. They picked it up and they said, "Oh, we took out this amount of them, took out that amount of them, did this, did that." He went
Yeah.
back to the US and
Look at this bowl of weird looking shit, and it's like some
and then they
fucking
like
chicken
pushed.
fetus or something.
Absolutely ridiculous.
And basically, in any case, that's what he did, was he went back to Nigeria and it got this operation done. And he said that he got the operation done by the man that he saw while he was in his coma.
Oh, okay.
If that kind of, anyway. So that was one of the first things that he did. But then when he had come back to the US, he came back to the US, and it was basically revealed that in the lead up to the Quiroga fight, he had been arrested several times on drug charges, and it had been kept quiet by whoever it was that was handling his PR.
Mhm.
That it somehow, if it was leaked to the press, that they were asked not to report it, or perhaps it just wasn't ever leaked to the press. And that it turned out that Akeem Anifowoshe had been, according to the police, very, very much connected to the cocaine and crack dealing business in and around Las Vegas for like a number of years and pretty much throughout his fighting career. And that he had been dealing drugs primarily and had been arrested several times with like rocks and rocks and rocks on him. And was also using, according to them.
Mhm.
And what was the capper, Aris?
Well, when we discussed this right before the show started, this shit's kind of crazy. As he was being stretchered out and they were taking off his clothes, his trunks and stuff like that, they found some cocaine in his protective cuff. He was carrying during the fight.
Yeah, like probably so he could do some bumps immediately afterward, or something. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
That's something I know a lot of wrestlers have done back in the day, especially back, in the heyday of the '80s and stuff like that. Some of them just kept a little, some vials or whatever right in their trunks. But for a boxer to do that, I've never heard that, especially before the biggest fight of his career. But that's what I've read. That's what we've read. And I think it's
I
been verified too. That was actually the
Yeah,
truth.
no, that was like not a that was actually a ringside physician who found that. So that was not some like cop story that, what are we listening to? Some investigation. No, like that was a ringside physician.
That's insane.
So I mean, that it doesn't sound, it sounds like there was a lot of deception going on, and there was a lot of shit going on people didn't know about. He had three kids, and so basically he had three kids, and he had left his wife in the aftermath of this fight, and he was literally running the streets and
Mhm.
became a literal like riding the rails hobo.
Right.
Like literally rode the rails to LA, like for whatever reason he was going to LA and was riding rails from Las Vegas to LA, which is a fucking awful, like that's a terrible stretch. It's just desert and nothing. But in any case, Jesus Christ. So there was a lot going on with Anifowoshe, needless to say. And like I was saying before we start recording, dude, like I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a doctor, but it really would seem like all bets are off. I mean, like when you're adding this mixture of potential drug abuse and potential long-term drug abuse of something like cocaine, and then you're adding it to, like a fight where these guys are just taking punches and punches and punches. It's not a good mixture, dude. It's not a good mixture at all.
I mean, it's a terrible mixture at that point. You know what I mean? Like it's when you're doing a lot of outside the ring activities, you have vices like that, and stuff that definitely affects your body, something like cocaine, and then you're going in there and having an incredible fight. To that point where Quiroga, it's not a good mix. And you'd have to think too that if he had that in his cup, chances are he was using either before the fight that day, something around that time. So if they got drug tested, he probably would have popped. Well, I'm not sure. Did they even test him or yeah.
Texas Commission, bro. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
you know?
especially this is 1991, 2023. They're still completely screwed up
Yeah,
over
they
it.
might not even test it now. Much, I would imagine though, and even though it's not my thing, I would imagine that cocaine would be popular with fighters, dude. It's out of your system pretty quickly. It would kind of go with that sort of up lifestyle. I would imagine a little bit better than something that's more of a downer. I don't know. What do I know? But sounds bad.
Coming up in Vegas in the 80s, is still as kind of like a dude who, fresh in the United States and kind of being thrust into that scene as he turned professional. It's probably not easy, probably not difficult to say, see it, find it around, you know what I mean? So,
That's the Sin City, bro.
no,
That's
no,
Sin
it's,
fucking City.
but with all that being said too, and all the things he was getting into and like say riding the rails and all that, he still had it in his mind that he's going to still make a comeback in boxing because why not, right? That was his type of belief that he had. He still believed that he was going to come back and fight, and he still believed that he was going to be a world champion on top of that, which is insane on so many levels. Because once you suffer a brain injury, that should be it. You're never allowed to fight again, unless you're Joe Macy, apparently. But uh, it's like he was still training, I guess. And even Miguel Diaz in an article in a KO magazine article when he was being interviewed for something, and he mentioned Kid Akeem as being the most talented fighter he ever worked with. He said that he talked about it where he said, yeah, he suffered that brain injury, and then we heard that he got out of the hospital and he wanted to start boxing again. And so we were like, fine, we'll start working with him again. And he wanted to. Like Diaz was willing to work with him again, which is again very questionable in itself. But none of that really panned out because eventually he ends up getting deported.
Well, and it sounded like Miguel Diaz felt really bad too. Like
Oh,
he
of
was
course.
ready to quit. Like he had never been close to like a situation where a fighter had gotten seriously injured. And he was basically like, what the fuck are we doing here? Like having an existential crisis type of shit. And Cedric Kushner also said that he's like, I've been involved in so many fights and I never for one single time had ever had a fighter, get seriously injured. So that was Cedric Kushner's first ever time too. Um, so yeah, you talked about deportation. What wound up happening is that Anifowoshe sells crack to an undercover cop.
That'll do.
Classic. Well, dude, he had apparently gotten like several different like stays, like for like sentencing for different various things, like or he had gotten let off light or gotten charges reduced or dropped or whatever. And so there are all these instances where he probably should have been deported like long before this, or something else should have happened long before this, until finally he sells to an undercover cop. and then he gets taken to the same, I believe, facility that later on Ike Ibeabushi was taken to in Arizona. Like it's basically in like an ICE or like an immigration holding facility for immigrants who are going to be deported. Um, and he was held there for a while before he eventually being deported back to Nigeria. After that, I don't know. After that, I cannot find any like actual confirmation about what happened. And after that, it's just kind of speculation. But the speculation is pretty wild.
It really is. And so Diaz again alluded to it in his KO article, because it's kind of the same thing we all know. No one really knows exactly what happened or where it happened, the exact date or anything like that for that matter. It's just that after he got deported, um, it was known that what we do know from the small bits that we do is that like he tried boxing again. Like we've talked about, you know what I mean? He tried getting back into the ring, and out there, you know, I guess it's easier, I guess, to convince people to want to work with you or whatever. And he started getting working and training again and working out, and apparently sparring. And I guess after one day he was sparring or something like that, they said he complained of a headache, went to go take a shower, collapsed, and just suddenly died.
There were rumors that it was an unsanctioned fight. There are rumors that it was sparring. There are rumors that it was training. You know, I mean, it's so there are a lot of kind of things unsubstantiated about it that nobody really knows for sure. The only thing that's certain is that he died.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, this is one of those situations where there, I mean, there have been a number of situations in boxing where a fighter died
Yeah.
and they wind up finding out later that they actually had an injury from years before or weeks before or a month or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like similar to how Benny Perret, many people speculate that it was actually the Fulmer fight where he got absolutely destroyed for
Yep.
like 2 straight rounds. Many people speculate that it was actually that had a lot to, I mean, pick your poison. Either way, he got pummeled. But in any case, yeah, it's not unheard of for something similar to happen.
Very many examples. You got Luther McCarthy, who was the Great White Hope.
Pelkey, yeah.
Yep, that everyone thought was gonna dethrone Jack Johnson or at least challenge him one day. And he was on a horse like a day or two before his fight with Arthur Pelkey, got thrown from it, suffered, you know, got beat, got banged up, but not enough that he thought anything of it. And so he had an injury pre-existing that no one even knew about, collapsed in the first round, barely even getting touched, and died right there. You have that one. You have people attribute Max Baer beating the absolute daylights out of what was the contender that died from Primo Carnera? Um,
Oh,
you know who I'm talking about,
I
Jack Sharp.
yeah, I just can't think of his name.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But people attribute the Bear fight to him. You know, Bear beat the crap out of that poor guy before that fight, and you know others like that. So yeah,
Yeah, it's so I who knows what really happened. I don't really know. But it doesn't sound like it was anything nefarious, like some gangland shit or
oh
like some
no,
shit where it was like set up or something. Like I said, dude, bets are off. Potential long-term drug use, uh, and a style where he took a fair amount of punishment, even just in that one fight. Who knows, man? The possibilities are they're vast.
it's just so dangerous though. Like the main thing is that he tried to probably try to get back into boxing, but with a brain injury, like you're never gonna fully recover from that. And like a guy when I mentioned Joe Macy earlier, like he suffered a brain bleed. It's different from getting like a major clot and having going for like massive surgery for hours, like Kid Akeem did, and others had to go through that. You know what I mean? But even he should have never been able to come back from that, and he was allowed to, you know, and which was really controversial in itself for a few fights that he had before he was forced to retire again. But Kid Akeem had a major like brain. It was a bad brain injury, like a bad one. You know, he had a clot. Like they took that out. The doctor said essentially because his pupil was dilated. They said that his brain was like all the pressure of it was trying to push his brain out of like a psych. It was akin to like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. Your brain is trying to squeeze out of this small part because all the pressure is coming out of it, and it's bad, really, really bad. And the fact that he tried to come back and then after getting deported, because again, what else is he gonna fall back on? There's literally nothing he can do now. Goes back into boxing because he thinks, okay, I got over this, I can still fight. And then I'm sure, I don't know if he was sparring without headgear, if like you said, a fight, whatever it is, but getting punched in the head with headgear without it after a brain injury is going to be a recipe for disaster. So
Yeah, man, it's bad stuff. Like I said, it's really impossible to know exactly what happened, but it sounds like a lot of it was kind of shrouded in mystery. On the other hand, Robert Quiroga, I mean, he, for the most part, led a fairly normal life after this. It sounds like he wasn't that adversely affected by, I mean, not that I could see anyway. I'm sure it did affect him. I'm sure seriously injuring.
after that, he didn't have a long career after that fight.
No,
So
he didn't. And like I said, he's kind of a strange temperament. Kind of quiet. Almost seemed he sounds like the kind of fighter where you'd have to prod him to talk, get stuff out of them.
yeah,
I've
he
done a
was
lot
very
of
low key.
interviews, and
Absolutely, very
I've
low
done
key.
a lot of interviews, and there have been a number of fighters where I'm kind of just like,
You got to pull stuff out of
come
him.
on, and
Yeah.
he kind of seemed like that a little bit. And
You got
yeah, so I don't know what his temperament was like as a fighter or whatever, but he fought again. It's not like he never fought again. It just took a while. Immediately after the fight, he said, "Oh, doctors are saying that it'll probably take 6 months of healing, but I'm pretty sure I'll be back before then." That was not the case, dude. He was pretty beaten up, man. Like he was pretty badly beaten up, to be honest.
I mean, with a facial damage like that, you have to take a long time off because it's going to be tough. Like a fight like that, even though you came out the winner and you never really recover from that, either not only mentally, but like the physical aspect of it too. Like you mentioned, Ray Mancini Duck who came. That was such a vicious fight. Mancini wasn't on top that much longer after that. Um, you have Nigel Benn when he went to hell and back with Gerald McClellan. He was not champ much longer after that. His career kind of was never really the same. Um, and again, Robert Quiroga, like he fought again. He did. He had a couple of more title defenses, but by the time he went to against an absolute bruiser by the name of Julio Borba in 1993, the gas tank had run out at that point, and Borba was a guy that's never really mentioned today, and kind of one of those junior bantamweight champions of the 90s who more or less is like more just I'm remembered in the record books as opposed to like fans having fond memories or whatever. But he was a bad man jam, a very tough guy, man. He was a very heavy fisted fighter.
Yeah, dude was
And
a puncher.
yes, all right, and just built like one too. Just one of them typical tanks. And um excuse me, fuck, I just messed up his name right there. Quiroga, well, already the damage that he's accumulated over his career, the facial damage that it just all you gotta do is breathe on him, he'll probably start cutting. And caught up, and he ends up getting stopped in 12 rounds. So you think his career is over by that? And he makes a one-off comeback against a guy by the name of Ansi Gedian in 1995. And if you remember that name, that was because he was known for being homeless while being, a top contender at one point, and like living out of the gym that Jesse Reed that he trained with at Jesse Reed. Good fighter though, very good fighter. Didn't have the best record, but he was only 10-7. But he scored an upset, went over Quiroga, and Quiroga promptly retired after that.
Yeah, the Haitian Hammer.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I followed him as a kid because I read that Ring magazine article. I thought it was interesting that he was homeless at one point while living in the gym and being a pro fighter. And so I started following him, and then he ended up fighting Botelli on Tuesday Night Fights.
yeah, he
Gone.
lost a decision to Mark Johnson like fairly early on.
Yeah, he was a good fighter. Yeah, he got thrown to the wolves relatively quickly, and that's why he was able to beat Quiroga, especially a comeback in one. Clearly
Yeah,
didn't have fire anymore.
yeah, and just Quiroga did not have a style that would lend well to longevity, dude. He's forward marching, throws a lot of punches, did move his head somewhat, but not in a way that I would call super productive. And he moved his head into a lot of Anifowoshe punches. You know what I mean? But like, yeah, just not the kind of style that you'd think would last super long, and it didn't. You know, his career, well, and that quote unquote comeback was 1995, and he lost it, and that was it for him. It sounded like he'd taken a couple of somewhat odd jobs after that, and as you know, I guess went back into society or whatever, and had been working and had been more or less living a fairly normal life. But it sounds like I don't know all of the details here because I don't know who I don't think they ever said who the friend was
Yeah.
that got something stolen. But a
Oh,
bit of a situation here. I'll let you recount this, but a bit of a situation arose in 2004.
that's right. It's such a stupid. It's such a awful situation too, and it's really fucked up. And it's like, because it's not, what an awful way to go out, and it's just like ridiculous when you think about it. So I don't remember the friend again, like you said too, but the backstory was that Quiroga was out drinking, having beers with a few acquaintances and friends, and like you said, at this point, he lived a low key lifestyle by all accounts after he retired, but he was still popular in San Antonio, still popular around his community, and by all means, a very good person. You know what I mean? Well meaning, kind of one of those guys you see around. Everyone, buy him a drink, he'd definitely be there to hang out with you, and just like a well meaning good person. You know what I mean? Just didn't really do much. You never saw him in the
Yeah,
headline.
he's a dude from around the way. You know what I'm saying? Like he was not a celebrity.
No, just a popular guy that was a former world champion that had a lot of good memories for people. But yeah, I never saw him in any blotters or anything like that. When you would read Outside the Ropes and Ring magazine, his name never came up in anything. So kept it until this situation. So like I said, they are out and they were outside drinking beers together and something like that. And one of the people that was there was a biker, a notorious biker by the name of Richard Merla, nicknamed Scarface. And he and Quiroga were, I don't know if they were friends, but they were definitely acquaintances. They kind of knew the same circles and all that. And Merla was a member of the Banditos. Banditos is a very notorious biker gang, kind of on the same level of like, the Hells Angels and other like 1% gangs that just will just jack your shit. You know what I mean? Like they do a lot of crimes and they don't take much to piss them off. You know what I mean? So everyone is drinking. They've been out for a while now, and I think it was that Quiroga mentioned something to Merla about, like you said, a long-standing. Merla stole, I believe it was a Scarface poster of all things, the movie Scarface. He stole a Scarface poster
Movie
from.
fucking sucks. Come on, you
It's not
guys.
that good. I mean, sorry, yeah. If you're listening to the show and you love it, whatever, fight us. Okay, it's not that good.
Movie
So
fucking sucks.
yeah, I've watched it a few times trying to get what people really are into, and I just can't do it. Then again, I'm sure there's a ton of movies that people think are atrocious that I love, so it is what it is. But yeah, Scarface is the most overrated movie ever. But I mean, that was the premise of this whole thing. Merla stole a Scarface poster from one of Quiroga's good friends. Um, I think it was because Merla's called Scarface, and he felt some kind. I don't. He felt some sort of way and wanted to steal it, so he steals it. Of all things, you know what I mean? But Quiroga, they're drinking and he brings it up to him. Yo, man, that time you stole his poster and yada yada yada. He mentioned something about that. And like I said about some of these dudes, it don't take much to piss them off. Even just mention something about the poster like that. And before anyone knew even anything that happened, again, Quiroga still has his guard down. He's not expecting anything. The other people standing around, they're not expecting anything either. And Merla gets really pissed off about this, and they were, arguing a little bit, and then it escalates to the point where like Quiroga turned his back or something, and Merla pounced on him, just absolutely pounced on him, took out a knife and just started wailing on him and going crazy. And Quiroga's not a big guy. We mentioned that too. He was like a very small, what was he like? Well, a little over like 5'2", 5'3", something like
Yeah, he
that.
was a little dude.
He's a little dude. Merla was not a little guy. Merla's a big guy. Over 6 foot or close to it. Outweighs Quiroga probably by a good amount of weight, over close to 100 pounds or so, I'm sure. And it wouldn't be, even though Quiroga is a former fighter, if they've been drinking and he's not anticipating anything, it wouldn't take much for this guy to get the better of him and overpower him, which he did. And he got on top of him and started attacking him, and then he started like stabbing him up. And the people around are like, "Yo, what the hell, Scarface? What are you doing?" And try to grab him up. And before you knew it, it was just a massacre, right? Practically.
Hiroga was left laying next to a car, and someone else saw him from the freeway and stopped. And then the cops were called, and that's pretty much what happened. The dude who stabbed him was caught later on. Arrest was made like a couple weeks later, and basically what wound up happening was, it's on the Wikipedia page and stuff like that, that this dude was kind of disowned or kicked out of the Banditos, but there's actually more than that. There's quite a bit more than that. Of course there's more than that. Who am I, bro? I gotta find some shit. But no, so the Banditos, like you said, a very well-known biker gang, biker crew, whatever you want to call them, motorcycle club. But not just in the US, but in different countries, had like a turf war and a drug war with Hell's Angels. And so, like that, I mean, if you're going to war with the hell, that's serious shit. It's Bloods and Crips type of shit, but on motorcycles. And so, you know, basically, this dude, Richard Merla, he actually was responsible for a couple of fairly high profile killings in the Banditos. Like he was responsible for taking out someone in the Hells Angels who was trying to like push into their turf with like their own small club or something like that. And so they killed this person, and they used this guy Richard Merla as like, the hitman to do it. And basically this guy had been involved in the Banditos for a long time. Point being, this guy was involved in some fairly high level shit going on within this motorcycle club, and either they just didn't like the heat that he brought, or I don't think it had anything to do with, oh man, you killed one of our San Antonio people, we don't like you now. I think it was more like they just didn't want the heat. I mean,
Sure.
I don't think these bikers grew hard all of a sudden, but like, but the thing is, when Richard Merla gets brought in, this fool spilled his guts, dude. This fool fucking gave it up, all of it. Like he admitted to like a ton of shit, and he literally was like, I don't give a fuck. I don't feel sorry for it. I don't care. I don't even give a shit. And so he went over pretty much exactly what happened, and it was pretty much as you described, dude. Quiroga confronted him about stealing a Scarface poster that belonged to one of his friends, and he was basically like, fuck you, stabbed him. And that was it. So I mean, dude, it's absolutely insane that these two random fighters, 115 pounds apiece, came up through their own separate careers, met each other, had this incredible fight, and it just all went to shit from there, bro.
It's insane, man. That's why we do these things, man, is because like you said earlier, this is one of those fights that, I mean, when people talk about like high profile and brain, injuries in boxing or like fights like that, this one kind of gets forgotten about over the years, for whatever reason. But um Quiroga and Kid Akeem were just two very, very good fighters that at that chance they had a chance to meet up, and on that unforgettable night, one night in 1991, and they put on an incredible fight. It was just one of those fights that like it changed both of their lives. Fortunately, neither for the better it seems, but like it was just for that one moment. They created history together, and like one of those nights that like people that were there, or if you watched it live on TV, or if you even seen it since then, it kind of sticks with you for its brutalness, for its honestness of two guys just going to war, and neither one, like you said, really wanted to back up either one, even though they were going at it, and you clearly can see in certain ways that they didn't really hoping that they it didn't have to get to this point, but neither one of them want to concede either at that, you know what I mean? So they're bonded by that moment, you know what I mean? And then they were bonded after that fight, and just they would always be known for that. And Gangland, remember the show Gangland, History Channel? They used
Yep,
to do.
I remember. I know exactly what you're gonna say too.
Yeah, Gangland did an episode on the Banditos one time,
Yep,
and the main person that they interviewed for that was Merla. And
because he was so forthcoming, because he was willing to talk to a whole bunch of people.
he was in jail at that point too, so he didn't give a shit, and he was just going over. And
Yeah, he already had a life sentence, so it was like, what are they gonna do?
but what a cold-hearted dude, man! Like they were talking about him, and he was like, you saw it in his eyes. He did not give a damn. He didn't give a shit what he did. Not at all. Nothing. Nothing phased him. Not at all. Nothing about that phased him. And he was even talking about if he ever had a chance to get out, it would be scary for them before the stuff he was going to do to, the banditos or other ones that wronged him, because he still, has that in his heart. I'm just like, damn. And I don't know if I told you this, said I don't know if I told you this, Pat, but
I
they
do
got
have that Cedric mustache. Yeah.
they Gangland got in touch. The producers of Gangland got in touch with Cedric before the show because they wanted footage of the Quiroga fight. And I don't think Cedric followed up with him at all or anything. But they found something. I don't know if they had I don't know if it was legal that they were able to show it, because I think Cedric was even a little annoyed or something like that. But they did show a clip, but I don't think it was from him.
They just do the old, like, film it on their cell phone on the
Some
computer.
shit like that. It definitely was. That it was like very clip. It was like very quick and fleeting, like something that was just in and out. You didn't see like a whole sustained action.
Not even worth like getting your attorneys fucking.
Yeah, because Cedric was like, he wrote this whole thing too. He was like, they should put this in the show. And he was like, of all my years of working in boxing, of all people I'm known as men, Robert Quiroga was a real man, was a real man's man, or something like that. And I told him, I'm like, they're not gonna put this in the show.
They're not even gonna know what this means, Cedric.
Yeah, and he was like, yes, they will. And I'm like, okay, sure.
That's fucking funny.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. Like he wrote this whole thing. He was like, they should add this for what I say. And I'm like, bro, they're not even gonna mention that you
You're not
promote.
producing the show, bro.
They just want a clip. They just know that you promote the fight. They're not even gonna mention that, like, bro, whatever. But at the end of the day, like, to get back to it, those are two guys that were bonded forever, and for that one night. Quiroga had a great respected career as an underrated junior bantamweight champion from the '90s and all that. Don't get me wrong, but he's gonna be forever remembered for that. Kid Akeem, same thing. Even though it was outside the ring activities, kind of darkened things a little bit, he's always going to be remembered for that one night in San Antonio when those guys came together and just created an absolute war. So
Lit the
that's what
place
I mean.
up.
Yeah, and they deserve to be remembered for that. And I'm glad we talked about this, because it is one of those fights that, like, it deserves to be shed its light, to have some light shed on it, even though it was unfortunate the way everything turned out.
Yeah, like I opened up saying, this is not us laughing at it. It's not us trying to ridicule it or anything. It's just, a lot of these things don't get remembered very well. Or if they do get remembered, it's like in fragments and pieces, and we can kind of try to bring it all together a little bit. So that's all we're really trying to do. And
Giving
on
you the
some, well, and on some level too, it's just something we enjoy. We get our jollies, not on the sad shit, but just on the history period. So
oh
it kind of scratches that itch for us too. But Aris, dude, I appreciate it, bro. Good
yeah,
shit, man.
man.
Good shit.
Yeah.
Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. However it is you tuned in. If you listened in on the podcast, thank you so much. Whatever app it is you listened into, subscribe, leave us a little rating or a comment. We appreciate that stuff. If you watch on YouTube, thanks again as well. Also appreciated. Subscribe, leave a comment. We'll try to get back to you. And as far as social media goes, we are both on, well, who knows at this point? It's all so up in the air, bro. But both of us individually are on social media. My boy Aris is on Twitter as Punch Zone Aris. I'm there as Patrick M. Connor. Also, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on both. Well, it's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, and it is on Facebook. So if you want to check us out there, you're more than welcome to. But in the meanwhile, say hello. We'll say hello back. And Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, y'all.